Hi everyone! Today it is our second video on how to draw flowers. For this video, all you will need is paper. I'm using Stonehenge by Legion paper, as well as a fine liner pen in 0.03 or 0.05. We will start by drawing the petals. We will begin with very light outlines. Later we will be going back and adding in shading, but to start we want to apply very little pressure to our pen. These outlines are essentially our guidelines for when we do go back and shade. These petals don't have to be perfect. You can see here, I'm just doing very rough outlines, almost sketchy little lines to create each petal. I will end up having 5 petals on this flower. The petals are not perfectly even. My bottom 2 petals are a little bit smaller than the top 3, which is totally okay. In nature, of course, flower petals will not all look the same, so in your drawing, they can all be different as well. Now I'm going to go in and draw the anther. This is where the pollen is stored on flowers. And they just look like little sticks in the center of the flower. Also very light, little pressure on your pen, and we will go back later and shade these. To start our shading, we will begin by having the shadows, the darkest part, at the base of the petal, closest to that little pollen area that we just drew in the center. These lines will be slightly curved, and you'll apply more pressure to your pen and sort of flick the pen out as you work towards the center to create lighter lines and lighter highlights towards the center of each petal. In all of my videos, I talk about how you can apply more or less pressure to the pen, depending on how dark you'd like your shadows to be. You can always go back in later and add more layers, more of these little lines, if you wish to have the shadows be darker. However, I always suggest starting out lighter and going back in so you don't make any mistakes. Each of these little shading lines should be touching and overlapping. This will make the petal appear smooth and almost soft like a petal would appear in real life in nature. So make sure all those pen lines are touching and there's no big gaps between each of them so that your petal has a more natural flow. Keep on working with the darkest shadows on each edge of the petal and working lighter and lighter towards the center. You will see me eventually go back and add more shading in to each dark area of the petal to sort of make those shadows more dramatic. But of course, like I said before, I'm starting out quite light with my shading lines. I like to shade a little bit farther into the center for this flower, bringing some lines farther in. And this helps create sort of the shape of the petal and gives the impression of there being little ripples in each of the petal in those areas where I bring the shading a little bit farther in. Many of these shading techniques will be familiar to you if you have watched any of my previous videos. I always talk about overlapping your shading lines and always going in and adding more layers so that your shading appears nice and smooth. When you're shading at the base of the petal, the place closest to the center of the flower, make sure that you're not drawing and shading over any of the little lines that you made to indicate where the pollen is, because we will go back in and shade those later. So just be very cautious, very careful in that area where those little lines are that we previously did. When you are finished one petal, feel free to move on to the next using the exact same shading techniques. Each petal will appear different because of course they're different shapes, so their shading may be a little bit in different places, but always start out the same way. You can add more ripples into one leaf, you can bring the shading farther into one petal if you'd wish, but each petal will end up appearing quite different from the other. And while I am making the shading a little bit darker near the edges of the petals, I am not retracing over the outline in very, very dark ink. I'm not pressing very hard to go over that outline once again because I do not want the outline to be darker than my shading. I added an extra fold into this petal just to make it a little bit more interesting. I will go back in and add the shading the exact same way I've been shading the petal all along, just as though it's darker on the edges of the little fold and a little bit lighter towards the center. You don't have to do this part, but if you want a little bit more of a challenge, you can definitely add a fold into a couple of your petals. And now it's time to finish the remaining 3 petals using the exact same techniques as for the first 2 petals. You can take a moment and pause and take a break if you need to at this point, but otherwise continue on and I will meet you back when we start with the center of the flower. Keep in mind all those shading techniques that we spoke about before as you continue on with this flower. You can then go in and sort of even up the petals if you need to, add in some darker shading in areas that you want to make the flower pop, if you want it to be a little bit more dramatic and stand out from your page. I always go back in and make the shadows a little bit darker at the end. Now we're going to move on to the center. These are actually super easy to shade. You just have to be very careful making sure that each little pollen piece stays separate from the next. So go in at the base of each of these little shapes that you've created, make it darker at the bottom, and slowly let the pressure off of your pen towards the top of each little pollen piece. Keeping them separate and just being very careful with your lines. After you're finished shading those, just go back into any little gaps and you can add a little bit darker shadows for a little bit more shading in there. Just going between each of the little pollen pieces. And you can see your flower is starting to look finished. And finally, don't forget to sign your finished piece. Thanks for watching and drawing along with me, and I will see you next time.